One of the central points of this book is that liberals and radicals have different approaches to racism and class. Their approaches to both of these systems are interrelated. Of the two intersecting systems, racism remains a more controversial and easily misunderstood concept because there is such a long history of denying its existence in the United States and other nations. Central to this denial is academia's preference for the race relations paradigm, which problematizes people of color rather than the system of racism. Sociology, often seen as the most liberal of the social science disciplines, contributes to this denial. What's more, people have different definitions and understandings of racism. When I first began studying racism as a student in the 1990s, I constantly had to explain the differences between so-called individual and institutional racism, and rarely found references to systemic racism in mainstream media. Today, the terms institutional racism and systemic racism have become more prevalent. I find that my students are much more familiar with these terms than they were even in the early 2000s. However, I'm not convinced that everyone knows what these terms mean, how they're connected, or how they should be defined. Therefore, it's important to distinguish between different manifestations of racism, how I define racism in this book, and what this has to do with the most modern forms of colorblind ideology, as well as what I call liberal white supremacy. Colorblindness and even racism-evasiveness are connected to a liberal ideology that focuses on non-confrontation. Historically, liberals have preferred a colorblind focus on unity and harmony. Using the words racial, race, minorities, or talking about the race issue is much less confrontational than defining the issue explicitly as racism. Ironically, when liberals do name racism and engage in discussion about it, they help reinforce racism-evasiveness, because these discussions are meant to assert their moral superiority over other less educated, stereotypically working-class European Americans. This liberal approach to racism and class reinforces liberal white supremacy. To understand this process, we must first address how we should define racism, its origins, sustenance, and consequences. Defining racism. The origins of race. Any definition of racism must begin with the origins of race as an idea. There are various theories on how racism emerged in the Americas. Audrey Smedley's and Theodore Allen's are probably the most accepted and supported in the social sciences. They and other scholars find that skin color was not a precursor to slavery. People of African descent were not automatically seen as inferior or uncivilized because they were darker in complexion. In fact, prior to the development of slavery in colonial Virginia, the English saw Africans as more civilized than the Irish.